Have you ever just looked at a world map and thought, something's not quite right? All those neat, clean lines dividing countries, they just don't seem to capture the messy, chaotic reality of the world we live in. Well, if you have, you're onto something huge, because that map in your head, the one we all use, isn't just outdated. It's wrong. Right? This is the world we're all taught in school. It's a tidy grid, a patchwork of countries with these fixed, permanent borders. It feels simple, it feels comforting, and for centuries, yeah, it's pretty much how we've understood power and place. But here's the thing, it's a snapshot of a world that just doesn't exist anymore. It completely misses the real forces that are actually shaping things. Because the reality on the ground is anything but clean. It's messy, it's intensely human. It's being constantly shaped by these powerful currents of migration, conflict, and all sorts of pressures that our static maps just can't show. Those lines we draw on paper are almost meaningless if you don't understand the forces that are pushing up against them every single day. And that brings us to the core idea we're going to unpack here. The map, as we know it, is a lie. Not like a malicious lie, but a really outdated one. We have to stop thinking of borders as these fixed, concrete walls. We need to start seeing them for what they really are: dynamic, flexible membranes that are constantly bulging and shrinking in response to pressure. And listen, this isn't just a cool metaphor. It's a whole new framework for seeing the world. Forget fixed lines. The new term is dynamic interfaces, and they operate between what this model calls strain regimes, these huge areas of high and low pressure. We're basically learning a whole new language for geopolitics, one that's all about pressure, not just lines in the sand. So to really get this, we need a new kind of map. The whole idea is called a strain tautology, and it does something pretty brilliant. It actually borrows concepts from physics to map out all those invisible pressures, the strains that are constantly pushing and pulling on our world. Okay, so the basic building block of this entire model is something called the strain unit. Now, think of it like a universal currency, but for pressure. It doesn't matter if that pressure is coming from poverty, from a war, or from a natural disaster. A strain unit gives us a standardized way to measure its impact on people. So when you start mapping all these strain units across the globe, you get what's called a strain field. And this is where it gets really cool. Just imagine a weather map, but instead of showing atmospheric pressure, it shows geopolitical pressure. The red zones, those are your high-pressure systems, the really unstable areas. And the blue zones, they're low pressure, calm and resilient. So where does all this pressure actually come from? Well, the model breaks it down into 8 key channels. Think of them as the ingredients for instability. You've got the obvious ones like economic hardship and conflict, but then you also have things like bad governance, digital divides, social breakdown, environmental disasters. It's the whole shebang. These are the forces creating the storms on our geopolitical weather map. What's really fascinating, though, is that not all strain is created equal. The model actually shows us what the biggest drivers of global instability are, and it's not random. Turns out conflict, bad governance, and economic stress are the true heavyweights, and they often get supercharged by things like sanctions or cyber attacks. This basically gives us a roadmap for where to look for the next big fault lines. All right, and this brings us to the real aha moment of this whole idea. If strain can flow across the globe like a weather system, then it stands to reason that the most important borders, the ones holding it back or channeling it, aren't the ones you see on a regular map at all. This slide just captures that shift in thinking perfectly. On the left, you've got our old map, right? Geographic borders, defined by rivers and mountains. But on the right, that's the new map. A chaotic, overlapping web of what are called influence borders. These are the invisible but incredibly powerful barriers and channels, things like sanctions, migration networks, information flows, that are truly shaping our world. So the huge takeaway here is that a border is no longer just a line on a map. A border can be a trade embargo that connects two economies. It can be a migration corridor that links a diaspora. Heck, it can even be a shared language used on the internet. These invisible forces create connections and divisions that are way more powerful than any physical wall. And this quote from the source it sums it all up perfectly. In this new map defined by pressure, what they call strain space, a country can be way closer to a distant ally than it is to the country right next door. It's a world where geography is no longer destiny. Okay, so what happens when the pressure along one of these invisible influence borders just gets too high? Well, it starts to literally bend the physical world. The strain becomes so intense that the lines on the actual physical map begin to warp and sometimes even break. And this happens in two main ways. The most common one is what's called de facto deformation. That's where the map on your wall stays the same, but the reality of who's in control on the ground has completely changed. Think of shifting front lines in a conflict. Then you have the much rarer event, legal deformation. And that's when the pressure becomes so undeniable that the rest of the world has no choice but to officially redraw the map. And look, this isn't just a theory. We've seen it happen. The breakup of the Soviet Union, the birth of countries like Eritrea or South Sudan. These weren't sudden, out-of-the-blue events. They were the end result of decades of accumulated strain that finally forced an official change to the world map. And you know what? This process usually follows a pretty predictable path. First, you have years, sometimes decades, of intense pressure building up along an influence border. Eventually, that pressure forces control on the ground to shift. That's your de facto change. And then, only then, sometimes much, much later, does the official map get redrawn to catch up with the new reality. It's a slow, powerful sequence of events. So this brings us to what might be the most powerful part of this whole framework. If we can map the strain, if we can identify these influence borders, then we can start to see the geopolitical fault lines. We can see where the pressure's building and maybe where the world is going to crack next. By mapping these invisible forces, we can maybe stop just reacting to headlines and actually start anticipating where the next crisis could erupt. Now, it's not a crystal ball, obviously, but it is an incredibly powerful tool for understanding the pressures that make future conflicts more or less likely. Let's just look at some real-world examples from the source material. The US-Mexico border, it's not just a line, it's a massive interface absorbing huge strain from migration and security pressures. Or look at the ring of borders around Sudan and South Sudan, which are buckling under the strain of conflict and displacement. In every single case, it's these invisible influence borders, driven by things like migration or security or resources, that are putting immense, measurable strain on the geographic borders we see on the map. So we end with this really big question. If the forces that truly divide and connect us, the flows of money, of information, of people, of power, are fundamentally invisible, then what does that mean for the maps we're all using to try and make sense of the world? Maybe it's time we started drawing some new ones.